Okay, so at this point, we're assuming that you've gotten your guided notes. And again, if you're looking right here, bottom, and of course, the assumption is you're taking some notes while we talk. So we're specifically looking at African Americans, Black Americans, we're looking at race and discrimination. And we're going to just kind of start with a little bit of an overview, a little bit of a timeline, if you will. So I would put this back 400 plus years. We would start it literally at the beginning of our nation, before we're even a country. Obviously, at the beginning, we'd be dealing with when we form a constitution. Founding fathers basically decided to ignore slavery and ignore the issue of racism that was separating us even then. They basically decided that if they tried to solve it, that we wouldn't even become a country. So you're going to see in our Constitution all kinds of compromises. Sometimes blacks are considered in population, but they're also considered to be property. Again, you're going to find all kinds of conversations that are happening from the very beginning. And of course, if you look at what the Constitution says, basically racial inferiority is right there in your face. So white Americans counted and other people did not. And so we have slavery, and then of course, we are going to fight a civil war. And when the Civil War comes about, the reason for the Civil War is slavery. There is maybe a glimmer of hope for about 2 decades, that maybe we were on the right track to solving some of our issues. Basically, for about 2 decades, blacks got elected to office. You saw a very conscientious effort of making blacks part of politics. That was very short-lasting. You would assume that, when you see in our Constitution that blacks have the right to vote and so forth, that would mean something, but it is very short-lived. Basically, when you start to see, shall we say, the North may win the Civil War, but Reconstruction is kind of won by the South. You start to see the federal government go home. You start to see the Southerners make their own laws regarding race. You start to see the civil courts put in place what we would consider separate but equal. So the big law that makes this okay, this is a Supreme Court decision, 1896. You have Plessy versus Ferguson. And if you look at that, it basically spells out that in the South is what they're referring to. It could have been applied anywhere in the nation, but we're looking really at Southern law, is that you can have separate facilities for everything, and it can be enforced, but in theory they're equal. And what you see is the separate part was followed, but not the equal part. So this is what de jure, by law, separates in schools, in restrooms, and drinking fountains. We would call it Jim Crow laws. Keeps people segregated and keeps people separate in society. Now, again, I think sometimes we mean to say, well, things are fine in the North because they're not passing all these Jim Crow laws. Let's be honest. First of all, majority of blacks in America at the time lived in the South, so it affected most blacks there in their lives. And what you find as people move north is the more blacks move north, the more segregated and the more pushback they get in the north as well. We call this de facto segregation in the north. Typically, not always by law, we find other ways of separating races. Then you get into, we talked about this earlier, it's kind of a misnomer to think that all of a sudden civil rights appears, because that's not true. But we think of the civil rights movement of the 50s, 60s, and of course we were looking at Emmett Till the other day and kind of said this is the beginning, the end, or the spark that starts things. This is the time period of activism, civil disobedience, Martin Luther King. This is where you start getting changes in voting rights. And then there is, by the later 60s, all kinds of laws on the books, and you would think that things would be getting better, but the fact is there's tons and tons and tons of frustration. Because even though laws have changed doesn't mean that the changes are coming easily. It does not mean everyone's accepting them. And a lot of these laws, let's just say it's too little, too late, and people are still fighting them. And you start to see more militant responses, frustration. People are tired of asking for rights that should be granted automatically. Sometimes black power kind of gets a violent connotation. I'm not saying that there isn't violence. I'm not saying that we don't have a different type of movement. But when we look a little closer, I think we have a lot of myths to break there too. And then, of course, we get into sometimes the 80s, 90s, 2000s, kind of depends where you kind of draw your lines. A lot of people felt that we were on the right track, that maybe not everything was solved, but that we had made huge, huge progress. Oftentimes, we look at different people getting the history-making moment where they're the first, and we kind of move on and say, well, problem solved. And the fact is that people would acknowledge that really that's not the case. And we're seeing obviously a lot right now in our own time period that, we might be on the verge of another movement. This is where you're starting to see a lot of people basically saying, how does this problem get solved now? A lot more talk about systemic racism. I would say we're kind of leaning towards, maybe white America needs to be more uncomfortable and acknowledge that they are the ones that need to kind of fix this. Is probably where we're going. Again, let's kind of define a little bit. We've got the overt, in-your-face, clearly identified racism, and then you've got the more systematic racism that is there, but maybe you can't delete a law, or you can't point a finger to this one person's the problem kind of thing. So if you're looking at overt racism, you're looking at things like lynching. I sometimes think we forget lynching is not just killings or hangings. Lynching is when you tie someone up, that kind of thing. Again, why does the South get probably called in racism more? That is one thing I do have to agree about. There is more lynching in the South. That is true. Right? You might be able to see this from this map.
Let me take, could you go back so we can take a picture? You can move down really fast.
What would, I will be back to that slide in a moment. Was that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right now I'm just showing a map of lynchings between 1877 and 1950. Again, when we talk about racism, this is why sometimes we talk more about the South as being racist. It is probably clear that it is more deadly in the South and that there is a reason to escape to the North. But again, I find that there's a myth that everything is great in the North, and that's not true. Okay. Overt would be anti-miscegenation laws, meaning blacks and whites can't marry. Redlining actually is prevalent in the North, even more so than the South, I would say. Redlining was basically where people could live. And this is a pretty modern, recent, intentional thing to do. A lot of this was happening after the civil rights movement had many successes. So this is basically laws or agreements or your city council basically deciding where people can and cannot live. And what you found was there was an area in town that blacks could live, and they were not to be living in other locations. This solved things like integrated schools because like schools were relatively based on where you lived. And what you're going to find is there's a lot more poverty. Think about the American dream. We tell people, own a home and it'll increase in value and so forth. Well, if you owned a home and you were white, that's probably true. But if you owned a home in black, you lived in these neighborhoods where the prices of homes didn't necessarily go up, that kind of thing. GI Bill's another awesome example. World War II, we come home and most Americans get a lot of benefits. They get free money. That's one of my favorites when we talk about government never gives handouts and blah, blah. We have all kinds of history. We get free land in Oklahoma, right? The GI Bill, economists would probably argue is awesome, great, fantastic, helped build our country in the late 20th century, but you had to be white to take advantage. So you could get free schooling if you were someone who'd been in the military and white. You could get a mortgage, help with building a nice home in the suburbs, that kind of stuff. You also see a lot of overt racism in our symbolism. This has come up a lot recently about statues, memorials, whether they should stay or should go. Should we take down these monuments? One thing that isn't clear to everybody is a lot of people feel these historical monuments are part of our history and they went up after the Civil War. Actually, a lot of the symbolism actually went up after the 60s or in the 30s. Like, a lot of this was intended to show white supremacy. So you start to see, again, a lot more Confederate flags. You'll start to see the statues of Lee, those kinds of things. And then there are some pretty blatant kinds of racism in media and movies. It could be as blatant as 1913's movie Birth of a Nation, where the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes of the story, or it might be more subtle, as in we don't acknowledge movies directed by Black Americans. So when you look at the systemic, this is institutional. This is racism that's just kind of embedded. It's actually pretty hard to get rid of. And being aware of it can help, but a lot of times this is hard for like one person to even move the needle. This can lead to discrimination on a more global thing. This has to do with healthcare, employment, and all that. And again, this is not necessarily people that are in your face or trying to be racist. It's just kind of a whole system. This I would refer to as things that we are being brought to our attention today. Things like who's in prison, whose schools aren't adequate. This has to do with who gets to vote, how they get to vote, what way they get to vote. Is it easy to vote, not easy to vote? This is when you look at neighborhoods and how they're different. This looks at even things like vaccines and COVID and who's getting it and so forth. Again, this is considered to be more the issue that we're dealing with today. And I'm going to stop for a second and give you a moment to have a quick conversation.